One time back in the 1990s, when I was in high school, I was left home alone for the night. That almost never happened because I came from a big family. My parents lived there, along with my older brother and sister, me, and my two younger sisters. With that many people in the house, somebody was almost always around. I honestly can't remember where everyone had gone that night. All I remember is that somehow every single person had somewhere else to be except me. For a few hours, the entire house was mine. At first, I wasn't scared. I wasn't a little kid anymore. I was in high school, old enough to stay by myself without freaking out. Still, the silence in the house felt strange in a way I couldn't shake. The kind of silence where every little sound suddenly feels louder than it should. Outside, it was already dark. Our neighborhood was normal, quiet suburban streets with houses close together. But that night, everything felt unusually still. Maybe an hour or two after everyone left, I went downstairs from my room to the kitchen to get something to drink. The kitchen sat toward the back of the house, and most of the lights were off. So the windows reflected darkness more than anything else. That was when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. At first, my brain almost refused to process it. But then I realized that there was someone outside, walking toward our back patio door. And right away, I knew it wasn't my dad or anyone in my family. It was just some man. What still bothers me is how calm he looked. He wasn't sneaking around or acting nervous. He walked toward the house like he already belonged there. Because the kitchen lights were mostly off, I don't think he noticed me standing there near the corner entrance. I had only stepped into the kitchen seconds earlier, and the angle probably hid me from his view. The moment I saw him, I froze completely. I remember staring at him while my mind tried to catch up with what I was seeing. It felt unreal for a second, like maybe there had to be some explanation that made sense. But then I looked at the back door, and I realized it was unlocked. The second that thought hit me, panic rushed through my body so fast it almost hurt. I was standing right next to the basement door, and instinct completely took over. Grabbed it, slipped inside, and quietly pulled it shut behind me. Almost immediately after I closed it, I heard the back door open upstairs. That sound is something I still remember clearly. Not loud, not violent. Just the simple sound of someone opening a door that should never have been opened. I ran down the basement stairs as fast as I could, but luckily the steps were carpeted, so my footsteps were muffled. Our basement was finished, though there wasn't much down there besides an old couch, a TV, and some storage. Near the couch, there were blankets piled on the floor, and without even thinking, I crawled under them like a little kid hiding from a nightmare. I could hear him moving around upstairs. Slow footsteps, calm footsteps. That somehow made it worse. If he had been stomping around or yelling, maybe it would have felt random or impulsive. But the way he walked sounded deliberate, almost like he was looking for something or someone. I remember holding my breath under those blankets, listening so hard my ears actually hurt. Every tiny creak in the floor above me made my stomach tighten. I kept thinking about the fact that there was no phone downstairs. Back then, I didn't have a cell phone either, so there was no way to call my parents or the police without going back upstairs. And I genuinely believed that if I tried, he would see me. I stayed hidden for what felt like forever. Honestly, I still don't know how long it really was. Fear completely distorted time. 5 minutes could have been 30. 30 could have been an hour. Eventually, the silence upstairs became almost unbearable. That was the strange part. I couldn't hear him anymore. No footsteps, no doors, nothing. For a while, I stayed under the blankets anyway because I was too afraid to trust the silence. Part of me kept thinking he might be standing perfectly still somewhere upstairs, listening, waiting, knowing I was hiding down there. Even now, I can't explain why I felt that so strongly, but I did. It honestly felt like he knew I was in the house the entire time. Finally, after sitting there shaking for who knows how long, I forced myself to move. I slowly crawled out from under the blankets and stood there in the dark basement, listening again. Still nothing. Very carefully, I made my way back upstairs. Every single step felt risky. By the time I reached the basement door leading into the kitchen, my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I slowly reached for the handle and cracked the door open just enough to look into the kitchen. I slowly looked around the kitchen and saw nothing. At first, I honestly thought maybe he had already left. The house was completely silent again, and after sitting in fear for so long, part of me desperately wanted to believe the whole thing was over. But the silence didn't feel normal. It felt heavy, almost like the house itself was holding its breath. There was a phone mounted on the kitchen wall, and I knew I had to get to it. I moved as quietly as I could, every step feeling unbelievably loud in my head. I kept expecting to suddenly hear footsteps behind me or see the man appear around the corner. But nothing happened. I grabbed the phone and immediately went back downstairs to the basement. Even then, I still didn't feel safe. My hands were shaking so badly that I remember struggling to dial properly. I called the police and told them there was a man inside our house. I gave them the address and tried to explain everything, though I was talking fast and probably not making much sense. At that point, I honestly didn't even know if the guy was still there. I kept telling myself he had probably left already. It seemed impossible that someone would still be inside after all that time without making a sound. But another part of me couldn't shake the feeling that he was still somewhere upstairs, waiting. So I stayed hidden in the basement until the police arrived. I remember sitting there in total silence, staring toward the basement stairs the entire time. Every second felt stretched out. I kept imagining hearing footsteps again. When the police finally got there, I went upstairs and let them in through the front door. Even with officers inside the house, I still felt nervous walking through those rooms. The whole place suddenly felt unfamiliar to me, like it wasn't really my home anymore. The officers searched the house room by room, and then they found him. To this day, that's the part that sticks with me the most. The man was still inside the house the entire time. He had been hiding upstairs in my bedroom, not the living room, not near the back door where he came in. My bedroom. I remember feeling this wave of shock hit me when the officer said that. It genuinely made my stomach drop. I had spent all that time downstairs convincing myself he was probably gone, while he was actually just one floor above me the entire time. Quiet, hiding. And honestly, that realization scared me more than seeing him in the first place, because it made me wonder what he had been doing up there while I was hiding in the basement. If he had heard me moving around, if he knew exactly where I was the whole time. Sometimes I still think about how silent he must have stayed while the police were on their way, almost like he believed he could just wait it out. My parents and some of my siblings came home not long after the police arrived. Everything after that feels kind of blurry now. I remember everyone being shocked, A lot of talking, officers moving through the house, and my parents trying to figure out what happened. But even now, years later, the thing I can't fully shake is the feeling of being hunted inside my own house. We never found out exactly why he chose our home, or why he ended up hiding in my room specifically. Maybe it was random. Maybe it wasn't. I honestly don't know which possibility is worse. What I do know is that our back door had been left unlocked simply because there were so many people constantly coming and going from the house. Nobody really thought much about it before that night. Afterward, though, everyone checked the locks constantly, because once you realize how vulnerable a place can be, it's impossible to see it the same way again. This happened back when I was a freshman in college. At the time, I lived alone in a dorm room inside an all-girls residence hall. It was a pretty standard setup. I had a bed, a desk, a dresser, a small couch, and a mini fridge crammed into the room, along with a few personal things I'd brought from home. The only annoying part was that there wasn't a bathroom inside the dorm itself. Everyone on the floor shared a community bathroom down the hallway. Thankfully, it wasn't as bad as it sounds, because the bathroom had several small private rooms inside, instead of one giant open space. One night, I stayed up really late doing homework. I had a pile of assignments and studying to finish, and by the time I was done, it was probably around midnight, or maybe even a little later. I wasn't someone who pulled all-nighters constantly, but every now and then college forces you into it. By the time I finished, the whole dorm floor felt dead quiet. I decided to go brush my teeth and use the bathroom before going to sleep. I left my room, turned right into the hallway, then headed down toward the bathrooms. I didn't bother locking my dorm room door because I was literally just stepping away for a few minutes. Nobody was ever really wandering around that late anyway, and the building itself had locked entrances from the outside, so the place always felt relatively safe. When I got to the bathroom, it was completely empty. No voices, no hair dryers, no doors opening and closing. Just silence and fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. I remember standing there brushing my teeth, thinking about how strangely quiet the building felt that night. A few minutes later, I went back to my room. Everything looked normal when I walked inside. Most of the lights were off except for the small lamp on my desk in the corner. The TV was still on quietly in the background because I'd left it running while I was gone. I shut off the lamp, climbed into bed, and turned toward the wall to try to fall asleep. I remember how exhausted I felt. Within maybe a minute, I was already starting to drift off. Then I heard my door open. The sound instantly pulled me awake. I sat up fast and turned toward the door, confused at first because my brain genuinely couldn't process why somebody would be entering my room that late at night. And that's when I saw him. I only caught a glimpse, but I clearly remember seeing what looked like a man stepping out of my dorm room. I didn't see his face at all, just part of his back and side as he slipped out the door. Then he quietly pulled it shut behind him and disappeared. For a second, I honestly just froze in bed trying to understand what I had just seen. It felt unreal, because the immediate thought in my head was, there should not be a man inside this building at all, especially not inside my room. I jumped out of bed, rushed to the door, and locked it immediately. My heart was pounding so hard at that point that I could actually feel it in my throat. I remember standing there, staring at the door for several seconds, almost expecting the handle to move again. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I had imagined it, because I was exhausted. Maybe it was somehow another girl from the dorm. My brain misinterpreted what I saw in the dark. But deep down, I knew what I saw. There had been someone in my room. I ended up calling campus safety and reporting what happened. An officer came to the building and searched around the hallways and common areas, but they never found anyone. Whoever had been there was already gone. Afterward, I sat in my room feeling completely unsettled, because the more I thought about it, the creepier the situation became. I'm almost certain now that the man must have entered my dorm room while I was down the hall in the bathroom. There's really no other explanation that makes sense to me. There's no way somebody could have already been inside before I left without me noticing. And what really disturbs me is the idea that while I came back into the room, turned off the lamp, and got into bed, he may have already been hiding somewhere inside the entire time. The room wasn't huge, but there were enough dark corners and places around furniture where somebody could stay out of sight temporarily, especially with only one small lamp on. That thought still gives me chills. For a while afterward, I tried convincing myself maybe he had simply walked into the wrong room by accident. College dorms can be confusing late at night, and people make mistakes. But the more I thought about it, the less that explanation made sense. If he had entered by accident, why stay hidden while I came back into the room? Why wait silently in the dark instead of immediately leaving or saying something? That's the part I've never been able to explain. Thankfully, nothing else like that ever happened during the rest of my time in college. But even now, years later, I still lock doors automatically because of that night. And sometimes, I still think about how close I came to falling asleep without ever realizing someone else was standing inside my dorm room watching me. Something really strange happened at my apartment a few months ago. And honestly, I still think about it sometimes, because I've never been able to come up with a normal explanation for it. I live alone in a one-bedroom apartment on the second floor of a fairly nice building. I've been there for a few years now, and for the most part, it's always felt safe. There are a lot of tenants in the building, but everyone mostly keeps to themselves. I don't really know my neighbors personally, and usually the hallways are quiet, especially late at night. One night, close to midnight, there was a knock at my front door. Right away, it felt wrong. It wasn't just because of the time either. There's something unsettling about unexpected knocking late at night when you live alone. Your brain instantly starts trying to figure out who it could possibly be. And when you can't think of anyone, the anxiety sets in fast. I walked over quietly and looked through the peephole. What I saw immediately confused me. There was a man standing outside my door wearing a dark suit and sunglasses. Even now, I can't explain why the sunglasses bothered me so much. But they did. It was almost midnight inside a dim apartment hallway. Why would somebody be wearing sunglasses? The whole thing felt bizarre from the start. And for some reason, even though every instinct should have told me not to, I actually opened the door. To this day, I still don't fully know why. Maybe because he looked calm. Maybe because part of me assumed there had to be some logical explanation. Or maybe because when something is strange enough, your brain almost stops treating it like danger at first. It just feels unreal. When I opened the door, the man stood there a couple of steps away, staring directly at me. Then I realized he wasn't alone. Farther down the hallway were 4 more men, all of them wearing suits, all of them wearing sunglasses. Every single one of them was standing perfectly still. I remember this cold feeling immediately spreading through my stomach because the situation suddenly felt deeply unnatural, not just creepy, wrong. I asked if I could help them, and I know I sounded confused because I was. None of them answered, not one word. The man closest to me just stared at me. The others farther down the hallway did the same. It was this uncomfortable, silent staring that made the entire hallway feel tense. I asked them who they were and what they wanted. Still nothing. No expression. No response. Just silence. And honestly, I think that silence scared me more than if they had yelled or threatened me. There's something terrifying about people acting in a way that feels completely detached from normal human behavior. It felt almost rehearsed, like they had all silently agreed not to speak. Then suddenly, almost at the exact same moment, they all started walking toward me. The men farther down the hallway moved first, and then the one closest to my door stepped forward too. Not running, not rushing, just calmly approaching me together. That was the exact moment fear fully hit me. I slammed the door shut as fast as I could and locked it immediately. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely think straight. And almost as soon as I locked it, they tried opening the door. I remember hearing the handle move and feeling this surge of panic because it suddenly became very real, that these men might actually try to come inside. I yelled through the door that I was calling the police. At that point, they stopped trying the handle, but strangely, they didn't leave either. I looked through the peephole again, and all 5 of them were just standing there in the hallway facing my door, completely silent, completely still, watching. That image still creeps me out when I think about it. There was no talking between them, no frustration, no whispering. They just stood there side by side, staring directly at my apartment like they were waiting for something. I remember standing there frozen on the other side of the door, trying to decide whether I should actually call the police. Part of me wondered if this was some bizarre prank or social media stunt. But another part of me kept thinking that normal people don't behave like that. And the longer they stood there silently, the more unsettled I became. The whole thing lasted maybe 2 or 3 minutes, but it felt much longer. Fear stretches time in a strange way. Then finally, without saying a word, all 5 of them simply turned around and walked away down the hallway together. I kept watching through the peephole until they disappeared completely. Even after they were gone, I waited a while before opening the door because I honestly half expected them to still be standing somewhere nearby out of sight. But they were gone. And after that night, I never saw them again. This happened to me fairly recently, which honestly makes it harder to brush off as some weird childhood memory or overactive imagination. I live alone in a first-floor apartment in a fairly normal, newer building. Nothing about the place has ever really felt unsafe before. One night, I was sitting by myself in the living room, just relaxing, when I suddenly got a text from a number I didn't recognize. The message simply said, "I'm watching you," all in capital letters. At first, I just stared at my phone, trying to make sense of it. My immediate reaction was that it had to be one of my friends messing with me. That felt like the only logical explanation. But even then, something about it still bothered me. Maybe it was how sudden it was, or maybe it was the fact that I didn't recognize the number at all. I remember trying to convince myself it was harmless while, at the exact same time, feeling this uncomfortable knot forming in my stomach. I texted back asking who it was. A little while later, I got another response. "The person that is watching you." Again, all caps. I should have expected an answer like that, but reading it still made my chest tighten a little. Suddenly, the apartment didn't feel as comfortable anymore. The weird thing was that all my blinds and curtains were closed. Nobody should have been able to see inside. That's what kept replaying in my head. If someone really was watching me, how? From where? Even though I felt ridiculous doing it, I started checking the apartment room by room. The place isn't big. It's just one bedroom, a bathroom, and an open kitchen/living room area. Still, I checked the closets, looked behind doors, and even checked the shower curtain like I was in some horror movie. I already knew nobody was inside, but fear has a way of making you do things you know don't make sense. After that, I looked through the peephole at the front door. The hallway outside was empty. I even opened the door for a second and looked around. Nothing. Then I checked the windows. My apartment faces the parking lot, and there were plenty of cars outside, but barely any movement. No people standing around. No obvious signs that anyone was actually watching me. And logically, even if someone was sitting out there somewhere, they still shouldn't have been able to see inside because my blinds were shut. That's what made the whole thing feel so unnerving. There was no proof of danger, but the texts somehow made the apartment feel exposed anyway. Like privacy itself had been broken somehow. I thought about replying again, but eventually I just blocked the number. Part of me hoped that if this really was one of my friends trying to scare me, they'd eventually admit it once they realized I wasn't playing along. For the rest of the night, though, nothing happened. No more texts, no noises outside. Every once in a while, I'd glance toward the windows or check the peephole again, but everything seemed normal. Eventually, I started calming down. Later that night, I got into bed and started reading for a bit before trying to sleep. That's when I suddenly heard knocking at my front door. Not loud banging, just this steady, repetitive knocking. Knock, knock, knock. Over and over. The second I heard it, every bit of fear from earlier came rushing back 10 times worse. My mind instantly connected it to the texts. I remember freezing in bed, staring toward my bedroom doorway, listening to it continue. What scared me most was how patient the knocking sounded. It wasn't aggressive or rushed. Whoever it was just kept knocking in the same calm rhythm, like they knew I was inside. Like they were waiting for me specifically. I was too afraid to even get up and look through the peephole. I knew my door was locked. But suddenly that didn't feel nearly as reassuring as it normally would. I grabbed my phone and held it ready to call the police if I heard the doorknob move or anything worse. The knocking kept going for what honestly felt much longer than it probably was. Maybe around a minute. But when you're scared and alone at night, a minute feels endless. Then it suddenly stopped. The silence afterwards somehow felt even worse. I stayed frozen in bed for a long time, just listening. I kept expecting another knock or footsteps outside my door, but there was nothing. The entire apartment building felt dead quiet. Eventually, I forced myself to leave the bedroom. I crept toward the front door and looked through the peephole. Nobody was there. That honestly unsettled me more than if I had actually seen someone standing there. Whoever had been knocking left without making a sound. No footsteps in the hallway, no doors opening or closing, nothing. I stayed awake for hours after that because I was too nervous to sleep. Every tiny sound in the apartment kept putting me on edge. I remember staring at the ceiling, wondering if somebody had been outside my door the entire time, watching for movement underneath it. Eventually, sometime really late into the night, exhaustion finally won and I fell asleep. And strangely, nothing else ever happened after that. No more texts, no more knocking, nothing. That almost makes it creepier to me because there was never any explanation or closure. If it had been one of my friends, I feel like they would have admitted it by now. And honestly, showing up at someone's apartment late at night just to keep a prank going feels way too extreme anyway. I've wondered if maybe it was a neighbor in the building, but I have absolutely no proof of that. To this day, I still don't know who sent those texts, who stood outside my door that night, or how they knew I was alone in the first place. My husband travels a lot for work, so being home alone in our house was something I'd gotten pretty used to over the years. Still, no matter how familiar you are with being alone, there are certain nights where the house just feels different. This happened a couple of years ago during one of his trips away. He was going to be gone for several days, so that night we did what we always do when he travels. We FaceTimed before bed. I was already in our bedroom while he was in his hotel room somewhere out of state. We talked for a while about normal things, how his trip was going, what I did during the day, little things like that. Eventually, it got late enough that we said goodnight. He told me he was exhausted and heading to sleep. And after we hung up, I stayed in bed watching a show because I wasn't really tired yet. Maybe 30 minutes later, I thought I heard something downstairs. At first, it was so faint that I wasn't even sure it was real. It sounded kind of like knocking at the front door, but from upstairs it was hard to tell. Houses make random noises at night all the time, and when you're alone, your brain tends to turn every sound into something suspicious. That's what I told myself anyway. Then, about half a minute later, I heard it again. This time it definitely sounded more like knocking. Not aggressive pounding, just a few steady knocks at the front door. Immediately, I felt uneasy. It was late enough that nobody should have been stopping by unexpectedly, especially not without texting or calling first. I got out of bed and looked through our bedroom window. But that side of the house didn't face the front yard, so I couldn't see anything useful. I stepped out into the upstairs hallway and went to another window that overlooked the front of the house. When I looked down, I saw a man walking through our yard. He was wearing a hooded jacket, and he was moving away from the front door area toward the garage. Because of the darkness and the hood, I couldn't see his face at all. Within seconds, he disappeared out of view. The whole thing instantly felt wrong to me. I remember standing there trying to come up with some innocent explanation for why somebody would be walking around our property that late at night. But nothing made sense. If he needed help or was looking for someone, why walk away so quickly? Why head toward the side of the house instead of back toward the street? And maybe this sounds irrational, but there was something about the way he moved that bothered me. He didn't look lost. He looked purposeful, like he knew exactly where he was going. I went downstairs after that and started checking the windows near the front door and living room. Every time I looked outside, though, I saw nothing. No man, no movement, no car pulling away. That almost made it worse somehow. It felt like he had vanished too quickly. I started going around the house checking every lock, even though I was pretty sure everything was already secured. I checked doors twice. I made sure the windows were covered. The house suddenly felt far too big for one person. Every dark hallway and every room I couldn't fully see made me uneasy. I tried calling my husband because I think I just wanted to hear another person's voice. But he didn't answer. He had already fallen asleep. That made me feel even more alone. To calm myself down, I turned on the outside light near the front door. I figured if the guy was still around somewhere, seeing lights on might discourage him from coming back. At least that's what I hoped. My biggest fear at that point was that he might try to break in. Eventually, I went back upstairs and got into bed again. After a while, I slowly started relaxing. Nothing else happened. No more knocking, no noises outside. I convinced myself that maybe it had just been some random person cutting through yards or knocking on the wrong house. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell asleep. Then sometime later in the night, I suddenly woke up. The first thing I heard was a dog barking somewhere nearby. Loud, repeated, non-stop. I'm pretty sure that's what woke me up. Several of our neighbors have dogs, but normally they were quiet at night. I honestly couldn't remember ever waking up because of them barking before. This sounded different. Persistent, agitated. The moment I opened my eyes, the memory of the man outside earlier came rushing back into my head. I lay there listening for a few seconds, trying to decide if I was overreacting. Part of me didn't want to go downstairs at all, but another part of me felt like I needed to check. So I got up and slowly made my way downstairs again. The house felt colder at night for some reason. Or maybe that was just fear. I remember the downstairs seeming unusually dark, even with a few lights on. I looked out through several windows toward the yard and the street. Everything looked completely normal. No movement, no figure standing outside, no cars creeping along the road, nothing. And then, almost as suddenly as it started, the dog barking stopped. The silence afterward felt incredibly heavy, almost unnatural. I remember standing there by the window for a moment longer, staring outside even though there was nothing to see, still unable to shake the feeling that something had been out there only moments earlier. At that point, I eventually convinced myself there was nothing I could really do besides try to go back to sleep. The house was quiet again, and after checking outside and seeing nothing, I started feeling almost embarrassed by how paranoid I had become. So I went back upstairs and finally fell asleep again. The next morning, everything felt completely normal. Sunlight was coming through the windows, the neighborhood looked peaceful, and honestly, part of me had already started rationalizing the whole thing in my head. I remember thinking maybe the man from the night before really had just knocked on the wrong house or cut through our yard for some innocent reason. Daylight has a way of making fear feel irrational. But that feeling disappeared the second I walked into our backyard. Near the back patio door, I noticed several deep marks scraped into the wall and along the edge of the door frame itself. At first, my brain almost didn't register what I was looking at. I just stood there staring at the damage, trying to understand it. Then it hit me. The marks looked exactly like someone had been trying to pry the back door open. I knew immediately they hadn't been there before. I honestly felt sick to my stomach in that moment. The fear from the night before came rushing back all at once. Except now it felt worse, because suddenly everything I had been afraid of seemed real. This wasn't just some strange guy knocking on doors anymore. Somebody had actually been in our backyard in the middle of the night, trying to get inside our house while I was alone upstairs sleeping. I took pictures right away and sent them to my husband. I remember my hands shaking while I was holding my phone. When he saw the pictures, he immediately told me to call the police. That's when another realization hit me. The dog barking. I suddenly became almost certain that the barking had started because the man was in our backyard at that exact moment. One of the neighbor's dogs must have seen or heard him moving around near our house. And honestly, the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. The barking had been loud, frantic, non-stop. And then suddenly it stopped shortly after I went downstairs and looked around. I truly think that dog scared him away. And that thought still unsettles me, because if the dog hadn't started barking, I don't know what would have happened next. Maybe he would have eventually given up anyway. Or maybe he would have gotten the door open. That's the part I try not to think about too much. The police came out after I called them, and I explained everything that had happened, from the knocking at the front door to seeing the hooded man in the yard and hearing the dog barking later that night. They examined the damage near the back door and agreed it looked like someone had tried to force their way inside. After that, my husband told me he didn't want me staying alone in the house until he got back home. Honestly, I didn't argue with him at all. By then, I was way too shaken up to spend another night there alone. I stayed at my parents' house for the rest of his trip because the idea of sleeping in that house by myself suddenly felt terrifying. The strange thing is, whoever the man was never came back. Once my husband returned home, we ended up installing security cameras around the property and improving some of the locks. Ever since then, nothing remotely similar has happened again. No suspicious people, no nighttime knocking, nothing. But even now, years later, I still think about how close that situation may have come to becoming something much worse. And honestly, as strange as it sounds, I'll probably always feel grateful to that neighbor's dog. Because there's a very real chance that barking may have been the only thing that stopped someone from getting into our house that night.